historian and a scholar of African-American literature and culture who gravitates towards 18th and 19th century literature and histories and the understudied American landscapes and people that deepen our understanding of possession, loss, nation, redemption, and triumph. Her books include Black Daughter of the Revolution, a literary biography of Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, Memoir of James Jackson, The Attentive and Obedient Scholar, an Encyclopedia of the Harlem Literary Renaissance. She loves Concord, Thoreau, the Cesar Robbins House, and all that it represents, and she is very glad to be back in New England today. Jake McGinnis is Assistant Professor of Humanities and Coordinator of the Interdisciplinary Sustainability Studies major at Graceland University. His research focuses on Thoreau, travel literature, and environmental thinking from the 19th century to today, and his work has often appeared or is forthcoming in the Concord Saunterer, ESQ, a journal of 19th century American literature and culture, and Studies in American Indian Literature, among other venues. His book, The Making of Thoreau's Excursions, is forthcoming with Bloomsbury. Please welcome our panelists, and we're going to start with Lois.
Thank you. I'm actually going to start a timer here. Not that I will behave, but I might. So this is clear, you can hear me. So my talk today, in the background lies a possible connection between what were called 19th century personal liberty laws, I'll explain that in a minute, and the crisis that we face in this nation today. So personal liberty laws were those adopted by the northern states in the early 19th century to try to protect free blacks and alleged fugitive slaves from federal slave catchers. So this old movement keeps coming to mind these days for me because undocumented immigrants seem to be today's free blacks and fugitives, persons who find their civil rights either denied or not available. And the question in the 19th century that comes back to us is when and how might a state like Massachusetts step in to ensure due process where the federal government has declined to do so. So my talk about these 19th century laws begins with a paragraph from Henry Thoreau's essay, Slavery in Massachusetts. That essay began as a response to the Anthony Burns affair. So you'll remember maybe that in May of 1854, an escaped slave named Anthony Burns was arrested in Boston. The proceedings about trying to get him back to Virginia threw the city into turmoil. Abolitionists tried to rescue him from the jail. It was a disaster. They killed a US deputy marshal. A lot of them got thrown in jail. So if the object was to rescue Burns, this was a mistake. By the following morning, an overwhelming force of federal troops and state militia had secured the building where Burns was held. And a week later, he was finally remanded to Virginia, led to a ship in the harbor, surrounded by a guard of federal marshals with pistols and cutlasses drawn. There was companies of Marines marching before and after, and artillery officers in horse-drawn carriages with a cannon bringing up the rear. In short, for a week in the spring of 1854, Boston was an occupied city with local law suspended and federal law carried out through force of arms. So before I turn to Thoreau's essay, I should explain what gave rise to personal liberty laws. So many of you must remember that in the original US Constitution, there was a fugitive slave clause. No person held to labor in one state, escaping into another, shall be discharged from such labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such labor may be due. So one curious thing about this clause is it's written in the passive voice. It never says who's supposed to do this, who's supposed to do the work. There's somebody who makes a claim, but how does that then get effected? So this clause gets called a self-executing clause, which is to say there's no other legislation needed the guy who makes this claim could just go and try to capture a slave. He must exercise this right. He has a right to do this, but he has to exercise the right by self-help alone. There was one attempt to make this a little clearer. That came in 1793 when George Washington signed into law the first Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed an enslaver to seize his runaway, take him before a federal judge, and upon satisfactory proof, get a warrant of rendition. Okay, but it says nothing, this 1793 law says nothing about the rights of the fugitive, rights that were elsewhere guaranteed in the Constitution, such as the right against improper seizures, the right of due process of law, the right of a trial by jury. So simply put, personal liberty laws in the early 19th century were attempts by northern states to kind of backfill and put in the civil liberties that are absent in the kind of silent parts of the constitutional provision. Now, I need to fill in one more thing before we get back to Thoreau. These laws sometimes included a thing called a writ of personal replevin, R-E-P-L-E-V-I-N. And I never knew what this was until about a month ago. So I'll assume that you don't know either. So replevin is a procedure whereby unlawfully seized goods can be restored to their owner. Say somebody takes your chattel against your will, say your cow. You can file a replevin action to get it back after a hearing to clarify the facts. So then there's a thing called a writ of personal replevin, which gets used in fugitive slave cases because the hearing to clarify the facts ends up being a trial by jury. So in a sense, when they talk about getting a writ of replevin, they're talking about trying to get trial by jury into the state laws regarding these either free blacks or alleged slaves, fugitives. And it might at first seem like it's not going to work if you get to a trial by jury and the enslaver actually does have a slave who's run away, maybe the jury will say, well, take it back. But in fact, of course, often there were free blacks detained, in which case that would be figured out by the jury. And often these were juries of northerners who might, insist, does the enslaver have proper papers to prove his case? Anyway, it was a hurdle put in the way of this self-help of the rendition of slaves. I find whenever I hear the phrase a writ of personal replevin, I can't remember what it means. So I've taken to calling it a writ of get my chattel back. So it's a writ of get my cow back. Only I have to say chattel because only in a time of chattel slavery would personal replevin make any sense. Okay, enough background. So slavery in Massachusetts. Thoreau dumps considerable scorn on the local officials who had helped in the rendition of Anthony Burns. And Thoreau writes, quote, a recent state law, they had done this despite, Thoreau writes, a recent state law making it penal for any officer of the Commonwealth to detain or aid in the detention of any person claimed as a fugitive slave. There was a law that made it illegal to help detain a slave. And these officials in Massachusetts had broken that law. And Thoreau adds also, I have a pencil here, which I don't need. Thoreau adds also, it was a matter of notoriety that a writ of replevin to take the fugitive out of the custody of the US Marshal could not be served for want of sufficient force to aid the officer. In other words, they had tried to instigate some of these things and they didn't have the power to do it. So anyway, in this one paragraph, Thoreau is referring to two distinct personal liberty laws. The earlier of these two comes from 1837, and it guaranteed that any person imprisoned or restrained of his liberty, shall be entitled to this writ of get my chattel back, as it was called. The act was actually called an act to restore trial by jury. It was an act to get a jury trial for the supposed imprisoned person. So this trial by jury law belongs to what I call the due process part of this history. Basically, from the time of the Constitution up until the 1840s, these laws get written and they're trying to backfill civil liberties into the vagueness of the federal laws. And they enumerate basically civil rights which are in the Constitution. Okay, this period of trying to get due process written into law comes to an end suddenly in 1842, when the Supreme Court, that venerable institution, the Supreme Court found that all personal liberty laws were unconstitutional. So the case leading up to this decision is called Prigg, P-R-I-G-G versus Pennsylvania. And it began when one Edward Prigg, it began when one Constable Stratton, an agent for Edward Prigg, did I get this right? No, it's Edward Prigg himself, who arrests runaway slaves in York County, Pennsylvania. Prigg is from Maryland. His slaves have run away. He goes to Pennsylvania and he captures them. And he takes them before a justice of the peace, who, because of the 1793 law, has to issue a certificate that says, okay, you could take them back. He goes before justices of the peace. And the justice of the peace in Pennsylvania refuses to issue the warrant for rendition. So right here, you had this conflict. I mean, we're now in the state of Pennsylvania. They have laws trying to protect these people. We have the enslaver from Virginia, from Maryland, who's trying to take his slaves back. And the justice in Pennsylvania won't do it because there are Pennsylvania laws that inhibit this. So Mr. Prigg can't get what he needs from local law. So what he does is to take his captives back to Maryland by himself. He just says, okay, I'm not going to get the certificate. I'm just going to take it back to Maryland. At which point the state of Pennsylvania indicts Mr. Prigg for kidnapping. Okay. So Mr. Prigg then appeals to the Supreme Court. Sadly. So then we get Justice Joseph Story, who delivers the opinion of the court. And it upheld an absolute right of recaption by self-help alone, and it declared unconstitutional all state laws interfering with that right. The Fugitive Slave Clause, Story writes, extended a new and positive right confined to no territorial limits and bounded by no state institutions or policy. Any law that interrupts, limits, delays, or postpones the enjoyment of that right contravenes the Constitution. So this ruling sweeps away the due process chapter of this story and initiates a second chapter, which I call the non-cooperation chapter. And it's best exemplified by the other personal liberty law that Thoreau refers to in Slavery in Massachusetts. So it's, what's the date of the Prigg decision? It's 1842. And the next year, 1843, we get a law in Massachusetts called the Latimer Law. And this statute says, as Thoreau says, that it's illegal for any officer of the state to aid in the retention of a fugitive slave. So I'll tell you how this law arose. In October of 1842, a certain Constable Stratton arrested a young black man named George Latimer, who was claimed to be a fugitive from labor by one James Gray of Virginia. So we have a Constable Stratton arrests Latimer, accused to be a runaway by James Gray. both this constable and the jailer named Cunningham, who holds Latimer in jail, both of these guys, the constable and the jailer, are actually acting as the enslaver Gray's agents, and he's paying them to do so. So we have two hired local officials who were helping out in the capture and holding of a supposed runaway. So as a consequence of this recent Supreme Court decision, the lawyers who represented Latimer ended up using two somewhat conflicting strategies to try to defend him. First, they tried to go back to the personal liberty laws. And second, if that wouldn't work, they tried to have the public officials, that is to say the constable and the jailer, stripped of their authority, giving that under this new Prig ruling, all proceedings done under color of state or local law are not supposed to have any legal standing. This is a little subtle, but there's two things going on here. So let's try to use the personal liberty laws. If that doesn't work, we're not going to help. And any official of the state of Massachusetts who tried to help should be barred from doing so. So using the first of these, the fact that there were laws in place to help, Latimer's defendants called on Justice Lemuel Shaw, Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, to issue a writ of habeas corpus. So habeas corpus means you have to bring the person you've arrested before a judge, and he decides if he's rightfully arrested. And ideally, Lemuel Shaw would have said, well, tell me the whole story here. But Lemuel Shaw doesn't really do that. Constable Stratton presents Latimer before the court. At the hearing, Latimer's defenders, they go back to their second idea. Once there's a hearing in place, they go back to the second idea to say, okay, he's being held by this jailer and this constable and stuff, but actually they should have no power to hold him because the Supreme Court has just said that. Sadly, Lemuel Shaw ignores this point. He says, you know, we've got a clear constitutional right to recapture your slave. There's a 1793 law that makes it clear already, and Gray has the right, and he sends Latimer back to jail, and where he's again held at enslaver Gray's convenience, and remember, at jailer Coolidge's profit. So then Latimer's friends go back to the first track and they appeal to this other personal liberty law, which allows them to issue a writ of personal get my cattle back, and that is the personal replevin. And they service on jailer Coolidge. That is, Coolidge is now supposed to bring Latimer back to the judge, and they're going to try to get a jury trial. The jailer denies the writ. He says, I'm not going to do that. And it goes back and forth and back and forth, but in the law, at the end of the day, Lemuel Shaw refuses to force anything to happen, and Latimer remains in jail. So the tension here is between, you know, who can act and how can they act and who can't act. So one thing to remember, note that when Thoreau mentions this second personal liberty law, he says the writ could not be served for want of sufficient force to aid the officer. So he seems to mean that when jailer Coolidge refused to honor this writ, someone, private citizens, the state militia, somebody should have forced him to do it. So this is Thoreau, not an advocate of nonviolence, but willing to see force used to enforce what he believes to be justice. Nor were his fellow citizens of Massachusetts disposed toward nonviolence. During the weeks when all this was going on, there was a tremendous outcry against the jailing and possible rendition of Latimer. When he was first detained, there was a crowd of over 300 Black men who surrounded the courthouse where he was held, threatening to release him. When Shaw discharged that first writ and the jailers were trying to take him back to jail, there was a crowd, there was a mob that tried to attack the jailers. Then there was a meeting at Faneuil Hall where curses were laid upon the Constitution, and Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison set about inciting the populace to a riot to release Latimer. And meanwhile, abolitionists had managed to force the sheriff of Suffolk County, who presided over the jailer, had forced the sheriff to get Latimer released from jail. So now we have poor enslaver Gray. He's left with nothing but self-help. I gotta quit soon. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna finish this quickly. He's left with nothing but self-help. He quits the game. He releases his rights to the slave for $400 and gets out of town. I'll just say, we'll come back to this in the question and answer period. I'll just say that what happens is this non-cooperation phase, we begin to get laws that mandate non-cooperation, that say anybody in the state of Massachusetts who cooperates is going to be subject to fines or imprisonment. Lawyers who cooperate are going to not be allowed to practice in the state. Judges who cooperate are going to be impeached. This is a series of non-cooperation laws. They are, in fact, civil disobedience and codified in law.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Colonial investments in enslavement of Africans, Native Americans, and those, as the 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties said, there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly give themselves to us or are sold to us. All of that exploded very quickly. In 1790, there were 698,000 enslaved people in the colonies. 70 years later, 2 years before Thoreau's death, there were just under 4 million. Enslaved people in the United States, as historian J. David Hacker notes, comprised about 50% of those enslaved in the Western Hemisphere, despite the US being the destination of less than 4% of enslaved people who survived the Middle Passage. The 1850s, the last full decade of Thoreau's life, was a turning point for him, for Concord, and for the nation. It began with the Missouri Compromise, which preserved enslavement, accommodated freedom in some newly admitted states, and its updated version of the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act compelled everyone to uphold enslavement and the rights of enslavers. One could be imprisoned for up to 6 months and fined what would be the equivalent today of $40,000 for your infraction. The spring of 1851 confirmed for Thoreau how speedily the Commonwealth would comply with this more draconian act. On April 4th, a self-emancipated 23-year-old man named Thomas Sims was arrested in Boston. The case was decided in days, and the governor, whom Thoreau believed was beyond redemption, or what he called the most cutting insult, organized the deportation. On April 12th, 500 armed US Marines, police, and night watchmen with swords drawn, billy clubs at the ready, formed a hollow square in which they placed Sims in the middle. And you can sort of see Sims in the middle over there. He was escorted with the mayor and the US Marshal on hand too to the Boston Naval Yard, where there he met 250 more officers who were tasked with ensuring that he board that ship for Georgia. The Sims case prompted Thoreau to blast his community. He wrote, in 75, 200 or 300 of the inhabitants of Concord assembled at one of the bridges with arms in their hands to assert the right of 3 millions to tax themselves, to have a voice in governing themselves. About a week ago, the authorities of Boston, having the sympathy of many of the inhabitants of Concord, assembled in the gray of the dawn, assisted by a still larger armed force, to send back a perfectly innocent man, and one whom they knew to be innocent, into a slavery as complete as the world ever knew. His raging did not stop there. He wrote, just a week afterward, These inhabitants of this town, who especially sympathize with the authorities of Boston in this their deed, caused the bells to be rung and the cannons to be fired to celebrate the courage and the love of liberty of those men who assembled at the bridge. Why, gentlemen, Thoreau said scathingly, even consistency, though it is much abused, is sometimes a virtue. One might think that he's cooled down just a bit when a paragraph later, he uses the phrase my townsmen instead of those inhabitants, but it's not so. I wish my townsmen to consider that whatever the human law may be, neither an individual nor a nation can ever deliberately commit the least act of injustice without having to pay the penalty for it. Thoreau seems overcome by a sobering cultural and racialized humility. Much as has been said about American slavery, he concludes, I think that commonly we do not yet realize what slavery is. The Sims case revealed a man and a city manacled by racism, by history and economics. Thoreau saw that. He became a prophet, fueled by the push of outrage and the pull of philosophical assessments. The catalyst here were the increasingly draconian pro-slavery state and federal policies, and the many emancipated people of African descent who traveled to, through, and around Concord in pursuit of what the Constitution called the blessings of liberty. 3 years later, in May and June of 1854, the arrest, trial, rescue attempt, deportation, and re-enslavement of Anthony Burns, who had emancipated himself from Virginia a few months earlier, took place. Once again, the might of the state and the federal government ensured that Massachusetts enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. On June 2nd, having been convicted by a federal jury, Burns was marched through the streets of Boston by some several companies of militia, members of the 4th U.S. Artillery stationed at, no less, you cannot make this up, Fort Independence. All told, 2,000 men escorted Burns to Long Wharf. William Lloyd Garrison's issue of The Liberator that day barely contained his outrage. It was a 5-part title in all capitals that led the pages-long coverage of what Garrison characterized, as you can see there, as another Sims case in Boston. Thoreau on that day was a world away from that chaos. He was heading up Assabet to Catalesia and Amersac. He was not in the presence of armed men, but of waving and slightly glaucous-tinged meadows of June, edged by the cool shade of shrubs and trees, a waving shore of shady bays and promontories that he declared to be beautiful and Elysian. He was aware of the Burns rendition. His journal entries that day reveal that he spread the natural world over it, demonstrating on the one hand, remarkable compartmentalization, and on the other, a blueprint for how to straddle a fallen world and a prelapsarian one. His first mention of the Burns case is preceded by details about a gorgeous flower that he believes would soon open on the bank near the ranunculus abortivus. And then his prose literally glides from that observation towards the morass in Boston. These days, he begins, it is left to one Mr. Loring to say whether a citizen of Massachusetts is a slave or not. Does anyone think that justice or God awaits Mr. Loring's decision? Outraged that the majority of American men in all regions were not, as Thoreau says, men of principle, he started thinking about how best to deal with them. And I quote, rather than thus consent to establish hell on earth, to be a party to this establishment, I would touch a match to blow up earth and hell together. But then Thoreau, the humanist, with an exit strategy emerges. As I love my life, I would side with the light and let the dark earth roll from under me, calling my mother and brother to follow me. His entry for May 29th, 1854 ends there. The very next entry on May 30th stands in sharp contrast to that revolutionary, explosive thinking. He provides a systematic chronicle of every step he takes that day. He details his finds of dead snakes, of lost odd-bodied feline creatures, the nests of ground robins, the sprouting of umbrella toadstools, and his census of the pink, a compact, mounded, 5-petaled wildflower Thoreau, and I quote, counted in one such tuft of an oval form 12 inches by 8, some 300 fully open buds, and about 3 times as many, more than 1,000 in all. We know that he surveyed land, he measured rods and rows, plots and acres with precision. Can we but wonder, though, if his steely attention to the lay of the land before him on that day was a way of stopping antebellum time, of ordering a shaken mind, and of pushing a wicked world aside? We know, though, that he was not stepping away from the fray. 4 weeks later, in Framingham, Massachusetts, on the 4th of July, he delivered what we know as slavery in America. So Thoreau and John Brown met first in March 1857, thanks to Frank Sanborn, who, as it happens, was born in the same year as the Nat Turner Rebellion. They had lunch that afternoon. Sanborn went off to teach, left Thoreau to babysit Brown. They talked through the afternoon, and then Thoreau joined over 100 people in the town hall at Brown's fundraising lecture. Emerson donated $25, the equivalent of about $913 today. Thoreau's father gave about 100, or $10, sorry, or just over $365 today. What Thoreau donated was so small, it has only been described politely as, quote, a trifle. He wasn't scrimping, though, he was protesting. He wanted Brown, a man who had just regaled him with stories of fighting ruffians and who had brandished a Bowie knife just minutes earlier, to tell him how the funds would be used. When they met next, it was 5 months before Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Thoreau emerged that day with a generous admiration for Brown. 5 days after John Brown was indicted for treason, Thoreau delivered the first public presentation of a plea for Captain John Brown. Emerson described it as an earnest eulogy of the hero. It is even more than that. Thoreau testifies on behalf of the defendant. He speaks as if he's counsel for him. He reveals that he, quote, read all the newspapers I could get within a week after the event, and I do not remember in them a single expression of sympathy for these men. I have since seen one noble statement in a Boston paper, not an editorial. Thoreau hails Brown as, quote, a man of rare common sense and directness of speech, as of action, a transcendentalist above all, a man of ideas and principles. That was what distinguished him. And he insists that Brown was, quote, not yielding to a whim or to transient impulses, but carrying out the purpose of a life. Then Thoreau testifies, I noticed that he did not overstate anything, but spoke within bounds. I remember particularly how in his speech here, he referred to what his family had suffered in Kansas without ever giving the least vent to his pent-up fire. It was a volcano with an ordinary chimney flue. Thoreau's insistence that Brown is an antebellum phenomenon continues. No man in America has ever stood up so persistently and effectively for the dignity of human nature, knowing himself a man and the equal of any and all governments. In that sense, Thoreau says, he was the most American of us all. At almost the midpoint, almost the exact point of the 8,518 words that make up the plea for Captain John Brown, Thoreau transports his listeners and readers into an empty Virginia courtroom to conduct a rhetorical postmortem. John Brown, he says, quote, needed no babbling lawyer making false issues to defend him. He was more a match for all the judges that American voters or office holders of whatever grade can create. He could not have been tried by a jury of his peers because his peers did not exist. When a man stands up serenely against the condemnation and vengeance of mankind, rising above them literally by a whole body, even though he were of late the vilest murderer who has settled that matter with himself, the spectacle is a sublime one. Brown, however, was a different spectacle when he appeared in the Charlestown, Virginia courtroom for the first time on October 25th, 1859, for jury selection. Eyewitnesses said that he seemed weak and haggard, with eyes swollen from wounds on the head, and that he had 3 sword stabs in his body and 1 saber cut over the heart. When the trial began the next day, Brown looked something better, and his eye was not so much swollen. He unsuccessfully petitioned the court for what he called a very short delay, which he said would allow him to, and I quote, in some degree recover and be able at least to listen to my trial and hear what questions are asked of the citizens and what their answers are. His request was denied. Court recessed for the morning. When the jailer went to fetch Brown for the afternoon session, quote, he found him in bed, from which he said he was unable to rise. He had to be carried into court on a cot, which was set down within the bar. Apparently, the prisoner laid most of the time with his eyes closed and the counterpane drawn up close to his chin. On October 27th, give you this. There's the cot, there we go. On the 3rd day of the trial, during which he cried openly upon hearing how one of his comrades died, Brown was led from the jail, walking very feebly, and he lay down upon his cot. Later, when several defense witnesses failed to appear, he arose from his mattress, evidently excited, and standing on his feet, asked once again for a delay so he could have what he called something done. On the 4th day, Brown was brought in, and he took his usual recumbent position in bed. On the final day of the trial, Brown resurrected himself once more and delivered the speech for which he is perhaps best known. He declared in part, "Now, if it is deemed necessary for me to forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." This last testament often obscures for us the fact that Brown attended his trial as a feeble, injured man, lying under a quilted coverlet. He was sentenced to death that day, but he left the courtroom and marched into history as a kind of divinely apocalyptic figure with flowing white hair, a long beard, and piercing eyes. Brown contemplated guilt and innocence too in his heroic closing statement. Quote, "I say I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done in behalf of his despised poor, is no wrong but right. I feel no consciousness of guilt." 2 of those phrases, no wrong but right, and I feel no consciousness of guilt, bring us back to the Thoreau who is incandescent at times about injustice, hypocrisy, tyranny, and dishonor. Brown's declaration may have reminded Thoreau of the time when he started a fire that burned 300 acres of Walden Woods. He and his companion at the time in 1844 were at Fairhaven Pond, and they started the fire with a match that they had forgotten they had. And they were looking forward to cooking fish by the shores of the pond. But unfortunately, the fire suddenly caught the dry grass of the previous year. He writes, "We sprang to extinguish it at first with our hands and feet, then we fought it with a board obtained from the boat, but in a few minutes it was beyond our reach. Being on the side of a hill, it upward rapidly spread through the long, dry, wiry grass interspersed with bushes." Thoreau's friend asks him with what sounds like what must have been an air of complete dismay and foreboding, "Well, where will this end?" Thoreau's reply, "It will go to town." Thoreau literally sits between heaven and hell as he beholds the increasing unholiness of the flames. He remembers that the fire leapt and crackled wildly and irreclaimably toward the wood, and that the flames spread with wild delight. Having raised the alarm, Thoreau goes to Fairhaven Cliff to observe the progress of the flames, which by this time have become a fire that is half a mile wide. As he watches farmers and townspeople below him, I'm missing a page. I have to go get it. Excuse me for just a moment. Thank you, Beverly. Lord. All right. All right, so as he watches farmers and townspeople below him being driven off by the fire, Thoreau says, quote, "We felt that we had no control over the demonic creature to which we had given birth. He cannot turn away from the conflagration, and he slips into another signature reverie. Quote, I have set fire to the forest, but I have done no wrong therein. And now it is as if the lightning had done it. These flames are but consuming their natural food." A match, a flame, an all-consuming fire, the earth scorched and changed. Two antebellum agents of change asserting they had done no wrong. Thoreau and Brown's revelatory resistance are deeply intertwined. Ultimately, one of them at an open-air trial of the times in Framingham and another in a courthouse in Charlestown, Virginia, exhorted the universe to deploy white-hot flames of righteousness that would eradicate evil and could be hailed for what they called consuming their natural food. Thank you.
Yes. I hope. Good afternoon. So, civil disobedience is, of course, a vital model for contemporary activism, and many activists, honestly, who haven't even read Thoreau, cite it as such. My talk is going to be about another model. In 2019, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg took what she called a sabbatical year. In August, she sailed from England to New York City to attend the United Nations Climate Action Summit on September 19th. She participated in strikes across the United States and Canada, including large demonstrations in Washington, D.C., New York, and Quebec, as well as smaller events in places like Iowa City and Rapid City, South Dakota. Along the way, she visited the Alberta tar sands, where she needed police protection, observed rapidly receding glaciers and beetle-killed forests in the Northern Rockies, documented social inequality across the United States, and witnessed the devastation of California wildfires firsthand. Then, in November 2019, she sailed across the Atlantic again in a 48-foot catamaran, dodging violent storms en route to Lisbon and Madrid, where she attended the 2019 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP25. Thunberg's activism and travels were well documented on both sides of the Atlantic, and her own account of her travels, a short narrative written in 12 parts entitled 6 Months on a Planet in Crisis, Greta Thunberg's travel diary from the US to Davos, was published in Time magazine in July 2020. In this talk, I'm going to consider Thoreau's legacy for contemporary revolutions, and particularly for Thunberg's work at the intersection of climate and social justice. Thunberg's work, including her famous school strike, which has inspired the international youth-led Fridays for Future movement, explicitly draws inspiration from civil disobedience. She actually cites it in some of her earliest published speeches. By framing her sabbatical year as a journey aimed to borrow a phrase from Thoreau, wake up her neighbors, Thunberg also highlights the revolutionary potential of lived experience and deliberately unsettling storytelling. Similarly, the ways that Thoreau wrote about travel in Walden, the Maine Woods, Cape Cod, the Journal, yes, I put Walden in that list too, and elsewhere are grounded in the radical potential of travel narratives to shake up one's sense of the world. Thoreau's Excursions, I've argued, suggest a method of writing for our own moment, a disruptive narrative form uniquely fitted to the emerging realities of the Anthropocene. Thunberg's travels, meanwhile, demonstrate the utility of such work for contemporary activism. I should have mentioned earlier, I do have some copies up front if anyone wants to read along as I present. The Anthropocene is a proposed geologic epoch characterized by the significant and lasting influence of human activities on the planet's geological and ecological systems. The term is hotly contested, and recent research has proposed that human influence represents a quote-unquote event rather than an era. In the environmental humanities, the term is widely used to describe any of a variety of specific moments in the history of human culture. We date it as variously as like it began in 1945 to it began with the transatlantic slave trade to it began with the beginning of human agriculture. These debates remain unsettled and very important, but Thoreau's moment is clearly part of a larger transformation in the relationship between humans and the planet and between humans and other humans. Besides the coming of the railroad and the massive changes in agricultural practices in Concord and beyond, besides the Industrial Revolution, besides the emergent global systems of trade and empire and colonialism, Thoreau's writing itself reflects a new moment in the history of environmental thought and culture. Thoreau doesn't seem to have thought of his work much in terms of genre, but for all his life, he was first and foremost a travel writer. Besides his famous penchant for walking upwards of 4 hours a day, regardless of the weather, and his notable excursions to points beyond Concord, his earliest literary successes were travel essays. Moreover, John Aldrich Christie and Robert Saddlemeyer have documented his extensive lifelong reading in the genre, from Champlain and Darwin and Humboldt to many, many others. Finally, of the 4 books published or nearly finished in his lifetime, all to varying degrees, draw from the conventions of travel literature. Indeed, Walden is paradoxically something of a travel essay, in which the narrator demonstrates how to travel a good deal without really leaving home, teaching us to view the environment around us with new eyes, including as a community. Thoreau also knew from his reading that travel literature was rapidly changing during the 19th century, particularly in the 1840s and 1850s. The narratives of discovery, exploration, and settlement which structured previous accounts of the North American continent were becoming something else. They were no longer tenable. The works that we now refer to as nature writing or environmental literature emerged from these new accounts of moving through places that were rapidly changing. Thus, works like Walden and the Maine Woods are sites of resilience and adaptation, and are considered foundational to nonfiction environmental writing still today. And of course, travel and lived experience on a changing planet remain as powerful today as ever. Thunberg's travel diary draws from many of the same conventions as Thoreau's Excursions, adapting travel and travel writing to this new moment in what I think of as a longer history of the Anthropocene. The text begins in New York, where Thunberg delivered her now famous speech to the United Nations Climate Action Summit, in which she alludes to the remaining carbon budget and calls out international leaders for their failure to act. But the only message that seems to have resonated, she writes of this moment, is "How dare you?" The chapters that follow veer between recording Thunberg's travels and impressions of the United States and Canada, and on the other hand, describing in accessible terms the science and politics of climate change. The voice is spare but measured, both in narrating specific moments and in reflecting on climate change and places visited. She frequently uses flashbacks, as in chapter 8, which reproduces experiences with an interviewer in Stockholm to frame broader comments on the media and public discourse. The climax of her travels occurs during her second transatlantic voyage, when she draws a connection between her small, vulnerable craft and the planet itself. The narrative closes shortly thereafter, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, just before the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. I want to highlight 3 characteristics of what I call the excursion form, all of which are relevant here to Thunberg. So 6 months on a planet in crisis is not nearly as ambitious a text as something like Walden. But Thunberg's travel diary is similar in 3 primary ways. First, the narrative is fundamentally grounded in home, and ultimately it works to change our perspectives on more familiar environments. This was a core principle of the literary style that Thoreau developed after 1850, while revising Walden and drafting such works as Yankee in Canada and Cape Cod. In August 6th, 1851, Thoreau wrote in his journal, "A man must generally get away some hundreds of miles from home before he can be said to begin his travels. Why not begin his travels at home? Would he have to go far or look very closely to discover novelties?" And indeed, Thoreau's works are all oriented toward Concord, from their routes to specific reflections about the landscape and culture. The value of a trip, he ultimately suggests, is how it resonates with and even changes our lives at home. Thunberg's narrative begins, meanwhile, with a striking disjunction. Arriving in New York, she describes being greeted by an image of herself with her dog, Roxy. It was like 40 feet tall, giant image projected on the side of a building. Already 7 weeks from home, the image suggests a sense of homesickness, but it also establishes the perspective and positionality of the narrator. Moreover, by orienting the essay toward home and Roxy, Thunberg emphasizes the situated nature in which meaning, and here activism, arise. While the phrase travel writing often brings to mind repeatable routes and destinations, 6 weeks on a planet in crisis, like Thoreau's Excursions, reflects a relational and phenomenological approach to travel, in which the meaning of a journey is meant to be shared and learned from, rather than strictly emulated or repeated, right? You wouldn't read Cape Cod to learn how to travel, right, to Provincetown. Second, Thoreau's Excursions and Thunberg's travel diary both foreground specific environments in motion. That is, these texts emphasize places that are undergoing rapid change due to human and non-human forces. Thoreau's descriptions of the Maine woods, for instance, reflect not only the ravages of industrial logging, but also the dramatic geoengineering projects which allowed lumberers to reverse the flow of headwaters lakes and thus transport pine logs to mills in Bangor, avoiding the St. John River to the north and thus bypassing British taxes. Likewise, his writing on Cape Cod dwells on the frailty of human life amidst a landscape that is literally shifting beneath the traveler's feet. In 6 months on a planet in crisis, meanwhile, Thunberg describes witnessing a beetle-killed forest in Jasper National Park, a phenomenon that has been directly linked to warmer winters, reduced snowpack, and hotter summers, and which is a tipping point, triggering a cascade of additional related disasters. The warmer winters lead to greater infestations of beetles, which lead to greater areas of dead and standing timber, which leads to wildfires with the capacity to blacken the skies thousands of miles away, even here on the East Coast. At the same time, glaciers in Jasper and nearby, throughout Western North America, really, and elsewhere, darkened by the soot of those same wildfires, recede faster yet, leading to still warmer, drier conditions in the mountains and downstream, even imperiling the water supply of up to about a quarter of the human population on Earth. The process ultimately spirals from local tipping points to planetary feedback loops, a world in motion. Third, Thunberg's travel diary and Thoreau's Excursions are both intentionally unsettling, suggesting alternative conceptions of home and even the human condition. There are, of course, many ways in which authors and activists might aim to disturb their audiences. Sometimes they don't even work that well. In Cape Cod, Thoreau records wreckers working the beach after the brig St. John ran aground off Cohasset, these laborers untangling valuable seaweed from the bloated bodies of drowned Irish immigrants. All the while, mourners and locals look on, and the narrator claims to be unaffected, but he's not in the end. Because it opens here amidst the tragedy and the everyday realities of making a living, Cape Cod signals the vicious reach of global capitalism, which leaves us trapped in disastrous relationships with other people, the world, and even ourselves. Similarly, Thunberg records being trapped within a broader global system. Not only does she observe those tipping points and feedback loops, which are themselves deeply disturbing, she also describes the harassment, conspiracy theories, and death threats that follow her in her travels. When COP25 was suddenly moved to Madrid due to social inequality and widespread protests in Chile, Thunberg found herself casting about for transportation back across the Atlantic, and she frames her choices as a matter of life and death. Amidst this background of violence and political chaos, human forces, in Thunberg's words, the buildup of hate and threat, become more menacing even than the stormy November ocean. Her second, far, far riskier voyage is presented thus as a metaphor for living on this increasingly dangerous planet. We are a civilization isolated in the middle of the universe, she writes. Space is our ocean and the planet is our boat, our one and only boat. More unsettling yet, Thunberg concludes that all of our political action is only a start, and that the climate crisis cannot be solved within our present economic and political systems. We need nothing short of a revolution. Thoreau has been called a patron saint of environmentalism, but his influence on climate activism has been relatively minor so far, even considering the significance of civil disobedience. Despite this, a broader, more careful reading of Thoreau's work, from Walden to his most experimental travel writing, reveals a startling process of adaptation that remains critically useful to writers and activists today. Works like The Maine Woods and Cape Cod in particular respond to planetary transformations and global economic systems by reimagining the very nature and purpose of travel. In these narratives, literary writing becomes a means of navigating the emergent forces of the Anthropocene, of offering the reader new perspectives on a world that is suddenly planetary in scale and, in many ways, more dangerous, more inhospitable than ever before. Across all her works, Thunberg explicitly frames the present moment as a crisis. It's time we read Thoreau and study Thoreau in the same way. Thanks.
Thank you to our panel. We've got lots of time for questions and answers, so feel free.
Thank you for these excellent talks. Lois, I was wondering if you could respond to a question about what do you think the lessons are of John Brown for today?
Keep your family close would be one lesson. Find a way to think about what it is you might be willing to die for. I think most of us think that we would stand up for a neighbor. But I think John Brown shows us that that is not the case. So what is our line in the sand? I think John Brown wouldn't necessarily, I mean, he's so conscious of who he takes with him into Harper's Ferry. He, during the trial, says, I didn't insist that anyone come with me. I laid out all the risks. These are men who are committed with me. So that was about choice. So I think the lesson from John Brown is, resistance can be deadly, but look, we're still talking about it, right? And now we get that history to overlay on this book. So resistance is key, but figure out what the limits, what line might you be willing to travel to? It's not just get out of your comfort zone, it's go to the edge. What is the absolute edge for you? Because that's where change can happen, that's historic. That would be my
Lois.
response.
I
Yes.
would say that.
So I have an old argument with John Brown. I don't like the violence. And I understand that the situation was dire, but without entering into that argument, I would like to just say that the question of violence is, in a way, it's in all of these talks. And Thunberg is threatened with violent responses to her activism. And, the puzzle in the history I was trying to lay out, there's a true contradiction in the Constitution between the Fugitive Slave Clause and the other guarantees. And could that have been somehow solved over the years without the violence that ended up really coming to a peak in the 1850s, leading to the Civil War? And I think at the time of the Constitution, the hope was that there was a promise of outlawing slavery in the state, in the Union, which was outlawed in the early 19th century. And maybe that would mean the slow abolition of slavery. There was a hope that the expansion into new territories might produce more free states, and somehow that would begin to, there were many people trying to figure out how to solve this, but they were unable to. So I guess I'm thinking about it in today's context. Violence is now being threatened on all sides, and it's incumbent upon us, I feel, to try to figure out how to find resistance that does not trigger more violence.
Thanks for your papers. I so enjoyed them. Jake, I bet that you taught Thunberg alongside Thoreau's writings, and I wondered if you could tell us how students are responding to that really brilliant pairing.
That's a great question, and honestly, it's all over the board. When I teach American environmental literature, we often begin with Walden, maybe some earlier works, and Thoreau feels familiar to them. They know Walden, even though they've never read anything by him, right? I mean, his reputation looms large, right? And it's a caricature, right? It's wrong, right? What they think is really not grounded in the text at all, which is fun to teach. And then we read a little bit of Thunberg. We talk about Thunberg a lot, but we read like Octavia Butler, and they are productively shocked, I would say. And pedagogically, that makes for some pretty fun conversations about what environmentalism is, what it will be, and ultimately how these kind of things fit together, right? Because they seem disparate at first glance, but I'm not sure that they ultimately are.
Is it parable of the story?
Yeah. So I teach Parable of the Sower alongside Walden. Those are the only two book-length texts that we read in that course.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, thank you. Your presentation were superb and coherent. So getting back to John Brown, and the problem was that to end slavery wasn't going to be done because people in the South, they were not going to give up their lifestyle. The abolitionists who preached a peaceful way to the North, they lacked it. Today, we have the ultra rich who have enslaved us with their technology, and they don't want to give up their lifestyle. 3,000-foot yachts, 1,000 of those, and but there's an essay in my files by Susan Griffin. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her, but what is scriptural. It's called The Politics of Imagination. So we have to draw out our imaginations big time and use them as an ally to sort of like engage in a battle of judicial with the enemy, because they have a weak point. They're cyclops. They only have one eye. We have multiple eyes. But please check out that. It's scripture. The Politics of Imagination.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful trio of presentations. I had a question, specifically not first presentation, but you drew our attention to to the passive voice in the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. And certainly that's one striking feature of that piece of language to me, but the other piece that is really striking is there's no reference to a human or to a body in that legislation. And I'm wondering, specifically in that context, but in general, both as people engaging with students and engaging in critical reading, and then also just more generally as citizens, what are the lessons we can take about how to read legal language, which can be very, very particular kind, very, very particular kind of text to engage with, that has a lot of power over us and a lot of power over the questions and the issues that we all are interested in, but especially young people are extremely interested in. So I'm wondering, both in that particular instance, and as we think about new laws that may be coming into effect, how can we ourselves in this room and the people we engage with learn more about how to understand what those laws bind us to and what we can play in interpreting them, working with them, resisting them, and helping people shape them in the future.
Well, you're right. I mean, the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution is deeply euphemistic. It doesn't use the word slavery. In a fuller version of my talk, I think one thing I would have done would be to tell the story of Anthony Burns in greater detail. And I briefly tried to tell the story of George Latimer in great detail. So you want to get down into how actual human beings are being treated. Or in the present day, to tell the full story of the Turkish woman who was seized in Somerville, or of Abrego Garcia, the man from El Salvador. And these stories are not being told in a way that our fellow citizens are really able to grasp them. Those of us who are happy and, have access to a lot of, I'd say, sensible news media may know these stories, but they're not out there. And so all that's left is the empty rhetoric of antagonism.
Yes, I'm going to ask Jake the question I was going to ask her. You used the phrase, Jake, it was nature writing for environmental literature, quote unquote. And are those synonyms, or are they different, or if so, how?
I'm going to give you Bill McKibben's answer because I like it, and it's what I teach my students. Nature writing and environmental literature are not the same, though they overlap quite a bit, and they have to do with orientation, right? So nature writing is like about the physical world. Environmental literature has an activist bent. That's the 20-second answer.
Works for me.
Thank you so much. Those are three great presentations. Lois, my question is for you. I was struck when you mentioned mispronounce this, the Stella longifolia and Lawrence Boston. I think you said the natural world goes over it, and that's so fascinating. I'm wondering about a couple of things. One is the way he's processing things, from journal to essay to speech in Framingham to the plea for John Brown. And the other is when he writes what signifies beauty when men are base. I had never thought of it until you mentioned that earlier journal passage. Is that a self-entitlement? And is it not just directed outward, but also at himself? And also just sort of made me think about what's the purpose of beauty? How is the natural world made it processed?
I think one of the, thank you for the question. I think one of the things that, if we use his language, wicked times, part of the damage that they do is that they try to suck the beauty out of the world in which we live. They try to take the beauty off the people that we see and behold, the humanity go. I mean, it's full unapologetic war in that sense. And so I do think it's an intriguing way of managing that. And I think you, Professor, spoke to how do you take care of your spirit and your soul and your family and your immediate surroundings so that you can not only survive, but thrive in order to then write your way into and inspire others and exhort them and rewrite laws, et cetera. So it's this interconnected process. And so what was fascinating to me, and it keeps just growing for me, are those, it's literally the push and pull. Every step he's taking, he's not divorced from, like, knowing he was on a river and going out into the woods as Anthony Burns is being led in one way, and Thoreau is taking himself in another, and watching him, knowing where he's gonna end up on July 4th. So you know he's not running away, but he is processing, absolutely. I don't think it's indictment necessarily of the turn towards beauty. I think that's probably, like, these days, some of us are saying that joy is the best revenge. Beauty, naming it, using it, relying on it, invoking it is another. But it's also, I think, the empowerment of the natural world, and it enables us to say that whatever that is unnatural, right? So even at the end where he says, where he's talking about the fire, consuming its natural, the natural is actually the opposite, right? That kindling, that dryness, that is not the stuff of thriving, of harvest, of abundance. That's detritus. Yes, it must be scorched in order to make the land anew. So it's just with Thoreau, this gorgeous sojourn that goes round and round. But we can't abandon the things that make us whole. I think that's part of our resistance. And I see Lois reaching for the microphone.
But I just want to say that I like it so much that you quoted from Thoreau's journal from the Anthony McGinnis period. Because when you read those journal entries, it's like 2 months, and what you see is a man who's suffering from intrusive thoughts. He cannot let go of this. So he keeps trying to write about the natural world, and suddenly he's writing about Anthony Burns. Then he goes back, and then suddenly he's, and this I feel, so he actually can't compartmentalize. And I'd like to just say that this is my own experience in the present moment. The damn newspaper comes into my house every morning. And, I feel like I'm living in a nation, I'm feeling like I'm living in a nation analogous to living in a house where there's a violent drunken man up on the second floor. And I'm in some danger at all times. And so right now, I myself suffer from intrusive thoughts of the kind that Thoreau, which means that my diversions, the things that I normally find pleasure in, are hard to maintain.
I was gonna just say, when I travel, I write poetry a lot on whatever available paper is there, like on wrappers and whatever. And, I really appreciate talking about Thoreau, doing this, Lois, because it's kind of, and the intrusive thoughts, because, NPR will be playing, and I'll be at like Robert Process, and I'll be like, oh, but wait a minute, I need to talk about this war, and then somehow tie it together. So I wonder if he uses it to, like, the contrast shows even more how beautiful the truth and what we need to be written is, and how horrible this is. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that. And when you were also talking about, like, unfurling and various things of nature, you were thinking that maybe he was using that to talk about the consciousness of America growing about enslavement and how bad it is and what justice needs to be, or am I just reaching around?
I don't think you're reaching. I do think that there are seasons, and we live into them and we resist them, but they come anyway. So our will does not, although there is crisis and the seasons themselves are under siege. But I do think that the way in which he is, I do think there's compartmentalization, but I think it's under siege. So I think the ways in which you say intrusive thoughts, it's just nipping. It's not a place that's sacred and that the outside world respects, but it is a way of marrying and containing and disciplining the chaos of the world. And the unfurling that he sees, and it's amazing, I think maybe now I'll go back and look at all the references he makes to things that are budding, because in that moment he also says, this is the flower that soon will blossom. And so he's trying to, again, remind himself and us perhaps that time has its own logic, its own agenda, and that, quote, the natural proceeds in a way independent of us, although that's under siege, that's assless. So, so there's discipline.
writ through. And there he is trying to negotiate where true power lies and where it is that we can thrive and what it is we can take comfort as well, because these are traumatic times. They're traumatic. And I think I've emerged from this conference with a real sense of how Thoreau has been under siege at various moments of his life. And he's just grappling with so much trauma and loss. And then there's the world on top of it that's complicating all of that. And he's living in a time without Advil, you know, I mean, so things that are unfurling, slow it down, right? They remind us that things are possible and that one can wait and there will be a reward and it will be
Thank you for coming.